Hello. This lecture provides an introduction and overview to whiskey, a broad and very popular category with lots of diverse examples, all made from grains. Grains are just the seeds of plants and include barley, corn, wheat, rye, and more. These seeds do not contain easily accessible sugars, so we're dealing with extra steps to get our starchy seeds to give our yeast some glucose to metabolize. The grains we use, the way we process them, and the types of distillations give us a huge range of styles. Then we have even more stylistic choices during our often mandated wood aging regimens. Let's get going. From the earliest days of distillation, the distillate was often called the water of life in Latin. Take aqua vitae and translate it into Gaelic, and you have uiscabach, which became whiskey over time. The US, Scotland, Canada, Ireland, and Japan all have very well respected and developed whiskey industries. What's in common is that whiskeys are all made from grains, and they are all matured in oak. Whiskeys are made around the world, and if you are deep in India, you may see some whiskey for sale that isn't grain-based. But if it leaves the country, it must be grain-based. It is by changing up which grains are used and what type of maturation that delineates these categories into an incredibly diverse range once in the glass. For this level, we will be looking at Scottish and American whiskeys, and then a brief overview of Canadian, Irish, and Japanese examples. Scotland really wanted to own the no-E whiskey, but traditions had already been in play before global commerce, and the name restrictions could not be employed. So no-E is Scotch, Canadian, and Japanese, with the US and Ireland using the E. We'll try to use those spellings accordingly. In the raw materials lecture, we discussed malting barley, so feel free to head over there to refresh yourself. As a quick refresher, we use malted barley to convert starches to fermentable sugars in a process called malting. Barley after harvest is pretty stable and can be stored for use at a later time, much different than, say, our fruits. Grains or seeds of barley are placed in a warm, damp environment and encouraged to start growing, thinking that it's springtime. The new plant will unpack its tightly bound starch granules and release enzymes to get ready to grow, like here. At this stage, it's called green malt. Now we kill the baby barley by heating with hot air, and now we have malted barley. The distiller can crush this into a coarse flour and mix it with water, and the enzymes that were released by the barley will convert the starches in barley to glucose. And very importantly, those same enzymes will convert the starches in other grains to glucose. Now, a recipe of grains used to make this wort is called the mash bill. Sometimes the percentage of grains in the mash bill are mandated for the style. Either way, our goal is to create a flavorful, sweet liquid full of fermentable sugars called wort. These other grains are not generally malted like barley. They are cooked to soften those starches and unwrap them to where the enzymes from some added barley can then convert them. Barley is not the only source of these enzymes, but their use may be required. For instance, only barley enzymes are allowed in Scotch whisky. Now, the term whiskey does not have any global restrictions with regard to stills that we can use, or the amount of time in an oak barrel, or its type or size. That happens in the individual countries and in our legally defined styles. Whiskey from Scotland, or Scotch whisky, must be made in Scotland. That means fermented, distilled, matured, and bottled in Scotland. The grains are actually allowed to be imported. Aging must take place in oak for a minimum of 3 years. This also has to happen in Scotland. Now, some caramel color can be added, but sugar is not allowed to be added. Now, there are a number of categories, but we're going to look a little deeper into two of the most important ones: single malt Scotch whisky and blended Scotch whisky. Now, depending on the category, there are further restrictions on production methods and raw materials. The first category we'll discuss is single malt Scotch whiskey. The Scotch means the previous rules about minimum age and Scottish provenance. The malt means 100% malted barley, and single means from a single distillery. These also must be made in pot stills, like these at Glenmorangie. The tallest still in Scotland here provides potential for lots of reflux and allows for a lighter style of spirit. Again, where cuts are made and how fast the stills are run matters just as much as the still shape, but we'll dig deeper into those in later lectures. Now, while there are lots of flavor variations, you can expect some cereal and barley flavors from the malt. Occasional peating of the malt can bring some heavy iodine, smoky character to the whiskey as well. Now on to our blended Scotch whiskey category. Still Scotch, meaning same rules on oak age and made in Scotland. Our blended here means it's made of at least one single malt and at least one single grain whiskey. Single meaning single distillery. The grain is usually corn or wheat, and they are almost always made in a column still like this. Remembering our distillation lecture, we tend to have very light, subtle flavors in these distillates. And we can make a lot of them continuously and more affordably than our single malts. Now, these are not as sexy as the pots, especially to consumers, so you usually never see these. And if you go to like Dewar's Aberfeldy Distillery, you see these stills instead. The bulk of the product in an affordable blended whiskey is often purchased from anonymous large industrial distilleries, and then the single malt or some of the single malt is made at the distillery that welcomes visitors. However, many brands, big brands like Dewar's, will sell a range of blends and will sell their single malts that they made in-house as well. And while blends can be made more affordably, this doesn't mean that it's an inferior product. Depending on your preferences, and certainly most Scotch drinkers drink blends, which they can have a wide range of styles. But regardless of category, the maturation regimen can have a large influence on the style that shows in the bottle. A minimum of 3 years in oak is the minimum. New oak is rare, and heavy char new oak, like we'll see in bourbon, is pretty much non-existent. However, that's where the barrels go after their use in the US. American bourbon barrels are the most widely used, and they impart vanilla, coconut, and spice character to the Scotch whiskey. Also used are Spanish sherry barrels, bringing orange peel and dried fruit to a whiskey. Also very common is wood finishing, where the aged spirit is placed in a barrel for a relatively short period of time, but the finishing barrel imparts character from whatever was last in it. You'll see rum, wine, beer, and more used as a finishing barrel that can add some color and flavors. On the label for our Scotch whiskeys, here's the Macallan 15, coming to you at, say, just under $200. The label designates it as single malt Scotch whiskey. No part of the blend is less than 15 years old, and they are also proud of their aging regimen with double cask of American and European sherry seasoned casks. Also, the natural color implies they didn't add caramel. These designations, along with cask strength, are not legally defined, but one hopes they are at least somewhat accurate. Then we have our $20 Dewar's White Label. Lots of messaging implying history and age and true Scotch and all the awards, but legally we have blended Scotch whiskey, which as they describe is a selection of fine whiskeys aged in oak and carefully blended. At the bottom, they make sure to state distilled, blended, and bottled in Scotland, but we already know that, but it sounds good to say. Back to our Macallan, you'll see it states Highland, which is one of the 5 designated whiskey regions in Scotland. Here they are, and if you're clever, you will count 6, but the islands are soon to be their own but are now included in the Highlands. Speyside has the most distilleries, and lots of our Glen this and Glen that come from Speyside. That also can be considered part of the Highlands too. Our Macallan is actually a Speyside, but they've decided Highland has more panache than Speyside. Contrary to popular belief, there are no mandated styles attached to these regions. It is generally assumed, though, that your Islay whiskey will have a peat character. Like, here's some folks at Kilchoman cutting peat from a bog. This is centuries-old organic matter that once dried can be burned. Think of it as pre-coal. It burns with a very pungent smoke. And if you use this as the source of your hot air to kill your germinating barley, that smoke aroma will attach to the barley and make it all the way to the bottle. Now, why would they go through all of this? Of course, it's by choice, but coincidentally, do you see any trees they could use for the fire instead? So, peat is dried and used instead. Now across the pond to the US and discuss a few of the many different types of whiskey made in the US. American whiskey just means made from grains and made in the US. The most well-known and available categories being bourbon, which can be made anywhere in the US, although Kentucky is the largest producer by state. Bourbon must be made with at least 51% corn in that grain recipe, or mash bill. The other grains are what are called small grains. They're used to add complexity and character and are often rye, which will give a spicy lemon pepper, caraway bread type character, or wheat, which gives a more soft bread and dough character. Many or most distillers will use a few different mash bills, so they have multiple spirits they can use for blending. Once the grains have been cooked to free up the starches, the various components are brought together with enzymes, usually malted barley, but they don't have to be, and then off to fermentation. From our fermentation lecture, we mentioned esters, and bourbon producers and pretty much all whiskey producers rely on fermentation to create fruity ester aromas. Think banana and orange character. These strong esters rely on specific fermentation temperatures and special yeast strains that are often jealously guarded secrets. Bourbons are usually distilled in a modified column still, but law restricts the ABV to much lower than neutral spirit levels, down around 80%, actually down at 80% ABV. Sometimes they look like a regular column with 8 to 10 plates, sometimes like this gorgeous one at Buffalo Trace. It's got a pot shape in stainless steel at the bottom, then 4 to 5 plates in that modified column before heading over to the condenser. And that's a great illustration of a small worm tub style condenser, like we discussed in the distillation lecture. You see the coil that circles around? The tube around it will be filled with cold water, and that in turn condenses the vapors in that copper tube prior to collection. Then by law, bourbon must be aged in new charred oak barrels, although there is no minimum aging required. These will give bourbon its vanilla, sweet spice, and coconut aromas and flavors. The Tennessee whiskey category is very similar to bourbon, except the geographical designation of needing to be made in Tennessee. It has the same 51% corn, new char barrel, and it has a minimum age of 2 years, unlike bourbon. But it has a difference in that the spirit is filtered through maple wood charcoal in a process called the Lincoln County process. Here is Jack Daniels, the dominant Tennessee whiskey producer, making charcoal from maple wood. Now, Jack is in Moore County, not Lincoln County, but never you mind. This filtration, regardless, helps soften and smooth out the spirit before it goes into barrel. Our rye whiskey is similar to bourbon as well, just with rye having to make up 51% of the grains in the mash bill. These have pretty robust lemon zest, spicy caraway and rye bread aromas with those same new oak flavors. With new oak being required, that means we are going to expect to see more color leaching. So color is actually not allowed to be added in any of these. Sugar cannot be added either, although the new oak and sweet corn character, it often feels and tastes like sugar has been added. Now with American whiskeys, and especially these categories, blending is hugely important. Not only are spirits from different yeast strains and mash bills used, but the mandated aging often happens in huge multi-storied warehouses like this one. Now this one's been damaged in a storm, but it lets you see what the inside is like. Now, if you are in a warm or hot climate like Kentucky, there will be a huge variation in the temperature for the barrels at the top versus those at the bottom. The incredible thermal mass of these barrels means the ones on the outside will have temperature changes by the day, where deep inside the warehouse, the temperatures will be more constant and the humidity will be greater as well. The hotter, drier barrels will have more color imparted into the spirit inside, more oak flavor as well. Now, selecting barrels of different ages from different locations in a warehouse can offer the distiller a lot of options on blending and for doing things like a special release. Now, when we see bourbon on the label, we already know American, 51% corn, and new oak barrel that's been charred. The word straight means the whiskey has been aged at least 2 years. In reality, most bourbon is aged around 4 years to get the required color. Small batch has no legal meaning, but it implies higher quality somehow. Single barrel doesn't yet have a legal definition either, but it's implied pretty strongly, so brands can get called out if they misuse it. You should see a number out of less than 200 if it really is. Of course, if you finish your whiskey in one of these for a bit before bottling, yes, it's a single 13,000 gallon barrel, I guess. Well, then we have age statements, and with bourbon, if any blending component is less than 4 years old, the age statement must appear on the bottle. The age statement has to be of the youngest spirits as well. Unfortunately, we see the mandated age statements ignored if we haven't made it to at least straight. Then our Tennessee whiskey, where we are bourbon, except maple charcoal filtered and made in Tennessee. We could call ourselves bourbon as well if we wanted to. The sour mash means we've taken the sour goo that was left over in the bottom of our column and used it in our fermentation to it seeds the mash. The acidic or sour nature makes many Saccharomyces strains more happy and helps get them started and therefore dominate the fermentation. Again, think consistency. Almost all whiskey producers do this. It just always shows on Jack Daniel's bottles, so it's often assumed to be a Tennessee thing. We also have a bottled in bond legal classification, which we'll cover in later lectures, but this dates back to our Wild West Prohibition and moonshine days, where a spirit's heritage was possibly dubious. It mandates, among other things, that a single distillery made the entire product. It was aged at least 4 years in wood and has to be bottled at 50% ABV or 100 proof. It's not a whiskey-only thing either. You can have bonded Applejack or apple brandy, for instance. So now we go to our other whiskeys, and now even though plural, we still have to care about the darn E. We're only going to briefly cover a few others, knowing full well there are additional whiskey traditions around the world that we'll cover in later 300 level lectures. But we will mention Canada. Canadian whiskey uses a number of grains, but they like to have rye play a strong role, but it's not mandated at all. What's different than Scotch and American protocols is that they will take each grain used and ferment, distill, and age it separately. The blender is considered the most important person in Canadian whiskey, as their craft in assembling the many components is paramount. Regarding still types, any is allowed, but how it usually works is that a base whiskey is made usually of corn to a very high ABV. Very light, mild intensity, this from a column still, and it's blended with one or more flavoring whiskeys that are usually lower ABV, pot distilled, rye-based spirits with fairly pronounced flavors. Think blended Scotch as a template, but with rye character rather than single malt barley character. Now, Irish whiskey almost went extinct a few decades ago, but has rebounded dramatically with lots of styles and techniques being deployed. We have high character pot still versions and column still corn or wheat based styles with light intensity. Or we have these two that are blended. Blending and aging is similar to how it's done in Scotland. Different than Scotland is that they also will use unmalted barley, which came about as a way to evade taxes that were based on malted barley. Japanese whiskey is linked to Scotland, with the fathers of Japanese whiskey being trained in Scotland. And like Scotland, you'll see columns used for grain or non-barley whiskeys, and then malted barley used in pot distillation. They are developing a lighter, very clean style that they can call their own. Unlike many other countries, distillers do not need to share or they tend to not buy spirits from outside. They produce all the components themselves. They are also moving to a labeling system that guarantees all spirits in a blend are made and matured in Japan. From this lecture, you should have an idea on what makes a whiskey from Scotland a Scotch whisky, how a single malt differs from a blended Scotch whisky. Also, when talking American whiskey, what makes a bourbon or a Tennessee whiskey or a rye whiskey, what they are legally. Then also a little on what is to be expected from Canada, Ireland, or Japan with their whiskeys. And most importantly is to step back and apply what you've learned about raw materials, fermentation, stills and distillation, maturation and finishing, and be able to see where the similarities are and where the differences are and connect those dots to what you get in the glass. Sláinte.